Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Gender Ideology Problems and Pro-Human Solutions webinar. My name is Brian Bartning. I'm the founder of FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and really thrilled to have you all here and excited to have our esteemed panel as well. I'm just going to say a few words and then turn it over to Colin Wright, who's going to moderate this panel. Some of you may wonder, what does it mean to be pro-human? And I just want to kick this off with, with just a short conversation about the principles that really embody FAIR's pro-human approach. The first principle is the principle of fairness. And so when we say what it means to be pro-human, we mean that it means to be fair, which means that every individual is treated equally under the law and is protected from disparate treatment based on skin color, religion, or other characteristics. The second principle is understanding. And I think this is a principle that really applies in particular to this conversation today. And this is the principle of being open-minded, tolerant for diverse viewpoints, also having a desire to seek rational decision-making, civil discourse, civil disagreement, and transparency. And the last principle of being pro-human is really this concept of seeing each person as unique and yet part of the same human race. What we have in common is our uniqueness. No two humans, I think from a medical standpoint, given that FAIR in Medicine actually was the group that originally organized this webinar, no two humans are genetically the same, but we share 99.9% of our genes. And I think that that's an important aspect of being human. And so one of the things that concerns all of us is the rise of what we would consider dehumanizing ideologies. I think that tonight you have an amazing panel that's going to talk about an issue that affects a lot of parents. I have 2 kids myself, and we talk a lot at FAIR about the issue of race essentialism. We haven't really talked much about what some call gender ideology in schools, but from my experience, the two go hand in hand. I think the institutions that are embracing a race essentialist ideology are also embracing a gender ideology. And for my own kids, the way that I saw this manifest is when my kids were very young. I mean, my daughter, I think, was in 1st grade when their school started to teach them, essentially sex ed. And so what you see with the gender ideology is that, basic concepts, the sexualizing of children starts at a much younger age. And so, I think rather than that being based on what's good for the child, that is being driven by an ideology. And that's one of the things that we'll be talking about tonight. So before I turn this over to Colin, I just want to acknowledge we have two members of FAIR's Board of Advisors on the panel with us this evening. So Abigail, who's one of the first people that I spoke with when we were first forming FAIR, and has just been an amazing supporter of FAIR every step of the way. So just want to acknowledge and thank Abigail for joining us. And Zander, who's also been, a really important part of the growth of FAIR. So thank you. And Carrie, I just want to acknowledge, who I think really pulled a lot of this together. So thank you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colin Wright to lead the panel. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian, for setting the stage for us today. And thanks everyone in the audience for coming to today's FAIR's inaugural foray into the topic of gender. It's a very volatile topic, as nearly all of you likely know. And certain viewpoints have been deemed sort of unmentionable or beyond the pale in many institutions and people in positions of power. So that's sort of why we're all here today, to sort of give air to some of the viewpoints that maybe aren't getting their time in the light. My name is Colin Wright. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm an editor here at FAIR. I'm the managing editor at Quillette magazine. I spent the last few years speaking and writing about issues surrounding biological sex and gender ideology. And I'm going to be the moderator for this webinar tonight. So we have a brilliant panel here today. So I'll start introducing them. So first we have Abigail Shrier, who Bayan mentioned. She's a Los Angeles-based writer, award-winning journalist, contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and FAIR advisor. In June of last year, she published the best-selling book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, which was named by The Economist as one of the notable books of 2020. Since publishing the book, she's emerged as one of the leading voices articulating the harms of gender ideology in her view. She has Substack, The Truth Fairy, where she continues to break news resulting from her investigations of activist teachers in public schools. So thanks for being here, Abigail. And then we have Zander Keig. So Zander is a FAIR advisor as well. The National Association of Social Workers Social Worker of the Year in 2020. He's an award-winning educator and public speaker. He served in various capacities as a clinician, a trainer, a consultant, advisor, and a mentor. He's also a transsexual man and is the recipient of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health's Harry Benjamin Distinguished Education Award. So we're glad to have you here, Zander. Thank you. Then we have Carrie Mendoza, MD, who's an emergency medicine physician in Chicagoland with 20 years of experience practicing in rural, suburban, and inner city ERs. Her work on the front lines of the healthcare safety net provides a view to the ever-changing range of challenges in our society and healthcare systems, from trauma to mental health to COVID. She is the state of Illinois' coordinator for FAIR and a FAIR in Medicine fellow, working to amplify our pro-human approach for fairness, understanding, and humanity in K-12 education and medical care. So thanks, Carrie. Then we have Dr. Miriam Grossman. She's a board-certified child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist, and the author of 4 books. She's exposed the dangers of gender ideology before most have even really heard of it in her 2009 book, You're Teaching My Child What? And Dr. Grossman's work has been translated into 10 languages. So we appreciate you having your perspective here, Dr. Grossman. Thanks for being here. Last but not least, Candice Jackson served as the acting assistant secretary for civil rights and then deputy general counsel for the U.S. Department of Education from April 2017 to January 2021. She and her wife and their twins now live in California, where Candice has returned to private law practice. Candice is alarmed at the deterioration of parents' rights in the education system and the recent trend for schools to replace education with ideology. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate having such a really great panel. All right, why is this topic, gender, so volatile? What are parents, from all over the political spectrum, despite what people try to portray as this inherently right-wing manifestation, what are they so upset about regarding what's being taught in public schools about gender identity? It's probably important to mention also that it's not just schools that's teaching this, although that's kind of what we're going to be talking today mostly about, but it's also in pop culture as well, playing just a gigantic role in the dissemination of the ideology surrounding gender. So what is gender ideology that people are so, especially parents, so upset about? So I'm going to try to take a quick stab at it, and people are free to disagree, but I just kind of want to put some things out there just so we're not talking over terms. We can actually maybe get some concepts to deal with. So gender ideology in broad strokes is the notion that the words, at least how it's taught in schools, the notion the words man and woman or boy and girl bear no necessary relation to one's biological sex, but are instead rooted in these innate gender identities, which upon prodding seem to relate to the degree to which one identifies with extreme stereotypes of masculinity or femininity. That these identities determine whether someone is a man, a woman, or somewhere in between, such as like a non-binary individual, and that potentially incorrect gender identities and their expected roles in society are being arbitrarily assigned to us at birth based on the appearance of our genitals. So that's kind of an overview of what I think most people mean maybe when they talk about gender ideology, and we can talk about differences if they come up in the Q&A. So people are concerned that these ideas are confusing children, especially perhaps gender nonconforming children, about what their behaviors and preferences mean about their biology and about their sex, leading some to believe that perhaps they've been born in the wrong body and that perhaps hormones and surgery are needed to bring their bodies into alignment with their minds. At least this seems to reflect some of the major concerns. So in this webinar, we're going to go over several different topics. We're going to discuss gender activism in schools, what to do about it, explore the mental health considerations relating to social affirmation without parental notification and why that seems to be so concerning. We're going to discuss what we used to teach and how it may have benefited LGBT youth in the past and maybe what has changed. Explore parental rights and potential legal recourse they can take, and then look at medical issues involved with pathologizing adolescents and medicalizing schools. So this is all being recorded. We'll try to leave some ample time at the end for questions from the audience, but make sure if you have a question that you enter it in the proper Q&A chat at the bottom right and not the normal chat. So without further ado, let's move on to the next round where I'm gonna ask questions of each of the panelists and they'll have some time to respond. And I'll move through each of the panelists and then hopefully we'll get to some good Q&A at the end. All sound good? Cool. So first up, we have a question for Abigail Shrier. So you have interviewed lots of parents and kids who appear to have been swept up in the ideology and what's going on inside many of our public schools. What have you learned from your investigations about what activism-minded teachers are doing in schools regarding gender identity education? Why do they seem to be doing this? And in your view, what can parents do to try and stop it?
Hi, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So, you know, both when I was researching for my book and in subsequent investigations, I found that certainly throughout the public school system, but also in private schools, activist teachers have been pushing gender ideology at every turn. They've been pushing it in GSA clubs, which are ostensibly to create a safe haven for gay students, but in fact, very often are breeding grounds for indoctrination, that the point is to push a particular ideology. Most recently, actually, I learned, I was given access to California Teachers Associations. This is the largest public school teachers union in California, in which the teachers talked about how to get kids into the GSA and various tactics for doing so. But one of the things I learned was that in middle school and elementary school, it turns out kids don't actually want to sit around talking about sexuality and gender with their teachers. Unsurprisingly, they'd actually rather be outside. And so many of the discussions were about how to get the kids in. Do we bring them in with candy? That was one of the proposals. But in every case, it was, let's keep this from parents. Secrecy goes hand in hand with gender ideology as it's pushed in the schools. They create gender support plans to change a child's name and pronouns without informing the parent. And they very often would directly tell children, this is a safe space just for us. What happens here stays here. So they were deliberately creating a secret zone from the parents. And, you know, these gender support plans that renamed kids, you know, gave kids new names and pronouns, that was enormously confusing to children. When you've been called a different name and a gender for a year by your entire school and your parents aren't aware of this, it's very not only confusing, but it's very damaging to your relationship with your own parents. So I want to say a few things about this, and you know I'm of course happy to take any kinds of questions. But the number one thing I want to state is. Well, first of all, this is not a gay or transgender issue, what's going on in schools. And it really is an issue of activist teachers. How do I know that? Well, first of all, a lot of the teachers who are pushing this the hardest are neither gay nor trans. But they are creating a secret zone from the parents, which in my view is both harmful and completely inappropriate. do I support, and by the way, gay parents, transgender parents, all sorts of parents have reached out to me to express support and concern over this. This really isn't a gay or trans issue, but it is an issue of activism. So why is gender ideology a problem when it comes to activism? My own belief is that gender ideology is completely inappropriate in the schools. There's no reason to teach it. It has no basis in fact. It is a quasi-religion. It emanates from revolutionary theory, and it has been incredibly confusing to children. And I would say that, while anti-racism and critical race theory is also very harmful to children, the harm of gender ideology actually comes up very quick, because the kids rush from this secret zone in which they explore, with the help of an activist teacher, a gender identity, to very quickly solidifying that identity and then wanting to make physical alterations that are irreversible. So I think it's a real harm. I think there is absolutely no reason to teach this in the schools. Now, on a final thought, well, what about the GSAs, the Gay Straight Alliance clubs? Okay, because I mentioned that there were activist teachers who were using these clubs for indoctrination, and really to peel away the kids from their parents. A lot of people use the word grooming. I've never used that word because I don't necessarily regard it as predatory so much as a goal to detach the child from the family and the family's values so that the teacher can substitute their own. In the absence of any proof that there is a predatory motive, I would never call it that. But I do think it's a deliberate attempt to peel a child away from the values of the home and peel them away from their parents so that the activist teacher can sort of push in their own values. Now, the question is, the last thing, Gay Straight Alliance clubs, is there a problem with them? I have absolutely no problem with them. Not only do I not have a problem with them, I happen to know from my own experience, I have very close friends who found them incredibly beneficial in school back in the day when they actually were a safe haven for gay kids. And I think that when it comes to matters of sexual orientation and sexuality, there needs to be, there is a place for discussing sexuality, of course, in school, and of course, sexual education. You just need complete transparency with the parents. There needs to end this whole practice where the school has secret discussions with the child. If they decide, and this happens, that the child is not getting sufficiently supported in their trans identity, they then call Child Protective Services. This is happening. It needs to stop. There is no secret zone that should exist between adults and children, and certainly not school teachers, social workers, their school therapists, and children that the parents don't know about. So if you're going to have a GSA in school, and I for one have absolutely no problem with that, then the parents need to be aware of it. That's it.
Awesome. Thanks, Abigail, for going over all that. There's definitely a lot to unpack, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions relating to what parents can do during the Q&A at the end. So I'm sure we'll get around to that. Up next, we have Dr. Miriam Grossman. So I want to talk to you about social affirmation. So social affirmation is now routinely done in schools, often without parental notification. Can you explain for all the viewers first what social affirmation is, and then why this practice is so concerning?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor. My practice right now consists exclusively of families with 1 or 2 gender-confused children. On a daily basis, I meet with these families who are in the worst crisis of their lives. I see children who hate their bodies and genuinely believe that they can escape their biology. I see parents who are terrified, traumatized, grieving, gaslit, isolated, enraged, and burnt out. I see the results of an assault on the bond between parent and child, husband and wife, brother and sister. This is the most difficult work that I have done in my 40 years as a physician. And that includes the years that I spent at a forensic hospital, which is basically a prison for mentally ill people who committed violent crimes. And when I worked in that location, I had patients, schizophrenic patients, who had murdered their loved ones. I had patients who were women that killed their babies. This work that I am doing right now with families is more difficult for me than anything else. And the reason for that is because schizophrenia is a terrible disease. And when something as awful as a murder results from someone's psychosis, it's a terrible tragedy. But what I'm seeing now is a man-made catastrophe. And that's what makes it so difficult. The question of social affirmation at school has a simple answer. Until we have conclusive research that indicates clear benefit, it shouldn't be happening. I'm not only talking about social affirmation without parental knowledge. I'm talking about just plain old social affirmation. So before I explain all my reasons, I just want to point out that the word affirmation itself is an example of using language to manipulate our thinking. A child who questions their sex is a very confused child. The only responsible and compassionate response is to recognize the child's distress while staying grounded in reality. And the reality is that biology can only be denied while paying a very, very high price for that denial. Affirmation sounds so kind and so supportive, but when the wrong ideas, when faulty ideas are affirmed, such as a dissociation between the mind and the body, it's not kind or supportive to affirm that in the long run. As adults, we have to focus on the long term, not the immediate response for the children under our care. So I want to talk about the consequences of affirmation for the child and for their peers, because we can't forget about the impact on their peers. So we basically have two groups when we look at kids who have gender dysphoria. We look at those who developed it before puberty and those, a more recent and large group that are developing it around the time and during puberty. And essentially, every study that we have of that first group shows that a majority desist if there's no intervention. In other words, the young kids, if there's no intervention, every study shows that the great majority of them will stop wishing that they were the opposite sex. And only about 2 to 12% will continue with gender dysphoria into adulthood. And most importantly, we have no way of knowing who's going to continue into adulthood with this and who's not. Of the group, the ROGD so-called group, we know anecdotally that there are significant number of people desisting. In my practice, I've had a girl who within 3 or 4 months of therapy realized that she is not a pansexual trans boy, but rather she is a heterosexual girl, and that she was under the influence of a few people that she met online while she was on lockdown, and they had a tremendous influence on her. We have no evidence that social affirmation decreases suicide and other negative outcomes. So affirmation is not a neutral thing, because it's actually the most powerful predictor of persisting into adulthood with gender dysphoria. And many who apparently would have desisted, would have stopped, they do not desist, and they move on toward medical interventions, which, as we know, are long, difficult, and dangerous. So affirmation is not a neutral thing. It's actually a form of treatment. It's an intervention, a psychosocial intervention, and it's an extremely controversial one. It's basically an experiment, and it's one that very likely will have a lifelong impact on the child. When trusted adults like teachers, principals, guidance counselors use a child's opposite sex name and pronouns, and they allow that child to use the opposite sex bathroom, it reinforces in the child's brain the ideas that they have, the false ideas that they have about their identity. The young brain, we know, is very elastic. It's not hardwired, it's resilient, and the neuronal pathways are impacted by what happens in the environment. So if these kids are just continually on a day-to-day basis, moment to moment, they're, let's say a girl comes in, her name was Sally, and then after Christmas vacation, she comes back and her name is Brent or something, a male name, and she is going to be called that continuously by every teacher, every peer, the principal, the PE teacher, everybody. It moves toward that child, toward persisting in the dissociation that she has between her mind and her body. And it moves her toward a further dangerous denial of her biology. Now, a word about parents. Parents are essential. Parents are essential in the evaluation, diagnosis, and treatment of a child with gender dysphoria. The fact that this even needs to be said is extremely troubling, but it is consistent with the premise of sexuality and gender education for the past many decades. And that premise is that parents don't know anything, parents are ignorant, parents are backward, homophobic, and transphobic. The child should listen to the experts at school and online because they know best. They will enlighten the child. They will help the child find their true self. And together, they will change the world. And this is the ideology that, like I say, for many decades has been part and parcel of sexuality and gender education. And that is why I wrote my book, You're Teaching My Child What?, which I wrote, is published in 2009. And it has a chapter there about the dangers of gender ideology. Now, just to mention the impact on other students of the social transition. So when Sally returns from her vacation as Blake, as I had testified in the California legislature against a bill that would permit this sort of ideology in the textbooks and in the classroom. And I argued that children are not miniature adults. Children don't have the capacity to grasp the idea of gender, the entire idea that you can reject your body and that you can be born in the wrong body, that you're only randomly assigned as male or female at birth. These are concepts that are beyond the understanding of I would say, elementary school children. And at the very least, it's going to confuse them. And at the very most, it's going to frighten them and cause symptoms such as what I've seen in my office is bedwetting after finding out about these concepts, anxiety, and so forth. Responsible adults protect children They don't expose them to age inappropriate material. The next thing that happens with the peers that are exposed to a friend who goes through a gender transition, social transition, is that they are led to believe that questioning your biology is a normal variation of child development, which it is not. They are led to believe that you can be born in the wrong body, which is impossible. No one is born in the wrong body. And perhaps most importantly, this is presented to them without an opportunity to really challenge the idea that Sally is now Blake, because no questioning is permitted. You're going to be called names if you're questioned. You're going to be excluded. You're going to be made to feel horrible if you question all these notions. And when questions are not allowed, and when ideas are presented over and over again without any questioning, that's called indoctrination, and that is what is happening to our kids. Lastly, the element of contagion, which of course we're aware of because of Dr. Lippman's research and because of Abigail's great book. We know that the social influence in this area is staggering, the amount of social influence. And so when one child comes back and is socially affirmed, and she's called by the male name and the new pronouns, and she's using the boys' bathroom, that's going to have a very large effect on the kids around her. So I'm just going to finish up by saying that I'm aware of a number of lawsuits that have been brought by parents against schools who have socially transitioned their children without their awareness. And that is a unacceptable thing. It's malfeasance. And I support those lawsuits. And I look forward to having more lawsuits until we sort out this whole thing and we really do protect our children, all of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That's a great survey of, I think, of the main findings and issues with affirmation that people have. The social, I think it's really facilitation of these identities is one of the more concerning aspects of this type of education I hear from parents. So I appreciate you going over that for us and everyone in the audience. So up next, we have Zander Keig. So Zander, you have a very valuable perspective here as a transsexual man yourself. So though the concept of gender and the way it's taught appears to have changed a lot, probably since the times when you were in school, can you talk about what education surrounding LGBT issues and gender, if they used that term then, how that looked when you were growing up, and what the benefits were of this type of education when it's done right, in your view?
Absolutely. Thank you, Colin. And thank you, Abigail and Miriam, also for your thoughtful words. I want to start out by saying that I'm in full agreement with Abigail that this lack of transparency is a problem, and I have no disagreement with that whatsoever. I also am in agreement with Miriam around this denial of biological sex as not being something that's working. I am a transsexual man. My sex is female. I don't have any problems saying that. That's my life story. So that is a very controversial thing. And because as a trans man, I speak in that way, it's caused me some problems socially. So, but I want to be really clear about that on the panel. I'm 55 years old, so when I was in grade school, middle school, and high school, it was in the 70s and early 80s. So yes, of course, things were quite different. And I was reflecting on what were some of the differences. And I mean, gender was coming up, but the way it was coming up and I've heard it mentioned already a couple of times, this idea of gender non-conforming. There was a way in which that was being challenged, but it was because it was the notion that women could do whatever women wanted to do. Girls could do whatever girls wanted to do, right? It was the free to be me and you time period. It was second wave feminism and this idea of sex essentialism, that there were things that, you know, males could do and things that females, you know, that it was very, very different. And so gender nonconforming and say a gender expression, like what kinds of clothes you could wear, and those are the kinds of things that were being challenged. And so they were being challenged in the way that there was more broad range of expression in dress, right? Girls started wearing, you know, blue jeans and pants to school, right? But there were a lot of restrictions around dress in some schools. I went to Catholic school. We definitely had dress restrictions that I fought against. And so, you know, gender nonconforming, although it wasn't mentioned in that way, was something that was going on, but it was something to be challenged. And so again, I mentioned free to be you and me, right? With in the 1970s, there was a lot of efforts around unisex, not bathrooms, of course, but unisex clothing. And I remember specifically in middle school wearing these clothes that I got at JCPenney's called Garanimals. And I noticed that Garanimals have been brought back, but they're very different. They're for like toddlers. It's a very different thing, and they're in boys and girls styles, whereas when I was wearing Garanimals, they were in the middle between the girls and boys section. And you picked out a shirt that had like a, I don't know, a giraffe or an elephant or a hippo on it, and then you found a pair of pants, and that's what you wore. And it was for boys and girls. They were in like earth tones. It was a big time back in, we wore earth shoes and earth tone clothes. You know, a lot of brown and orange. That's what was going on. It wasn't until 1984, and by then, you know, I was 18 years old, that the first semblance of what became the gay straight alliances was formed. And that was Project 10 was in the LA Unified School District. And the reason behind starting Project 10 was because a teacher at Fairfax High School in West Hollywood was made aware of a young Black gay boy who had been kicked out of his home, went from school to school, ended up being a dropout. So she created Project 10, the school teacher, Virginia Uraby, she's now deceased, in order to prevent dropout, right, for gay and lesbian kids at the time, right? There wasn't a lot of talk about trans kids. But, you know, I was a young gender nonconforming, to use contemporary language, girl, very much a lesbian. I prefer the term dyke. I don't really like lesbian. I think it's a little too passive. And, you know, so I found myself, I didn't have that kind of support system, but there were other things that I was able to tap into. And so, but this idea of creating this broader range of the ways in which I could express myself, I found a lot of freedom in that. And there was a lot of representation. I saw it in society, I saw it on television, I saw it in the movies. There were a lot of gay and lesbian characters in all of these places when I was growing up. So when I hear people say things like, I never saw any representation, I'm like, maybe they grew up Amish, because, you know, there's been representation about, you know, gay and lesbian and even trans characters, although unfortunately with a lot of trans characters that have been depicted, there's been a lot of negativity around, you know, around that. But it's I'm not the kind of person that needed to see these things out in TV land. It was just something that I came to learn about myself. And I'm an externalizing kind of person, which means that I didn't really care if I was following what society expected of me. Right, I wasn't looking for cues externally that I could be who I was. And so there's some differences between, you know, the type of people who need those external cues to feel validated, and those that are like me, who are like, screw your validation, I'm just going to be me. And I'm one of those kinds of kids. Well, I guess I'm now a 55-year-old, one of those kinds of kids. But this, you know, the idea of starting a social space or club where kids could come who were thinking about dropping out because they were being bullied or because their home life circumstances were not going very well. Like, that to me is an honorable, you know, reason for why these clubs, which became gay straight alliances in other schools, came to be. And so I want to recognize that, but I want to also recognize that, you know, there's some history as far as the criminalization of homosexuality that we have to contend with in our history, and the transmission of that trauma through the LGBT community over the last 50, 60 decade or years, 5 or 6 decades, about the experience of what that was like. I was a young adult living through the AIDS epidemic, and I saw families rejecting their kids and young gay men dying alone. Right. And so some of that history has been transmitted, the suffering, the trauma, the anger. I believe that's part of the reason why there's this overcorrection. I think that it's an overcorrection, this activism in the schools. I get the desire to protect children. I think all of us want to protect children. And I think that some people have either lived through or have heard about the experience that a school outed a kid to their parents, and then they ended up in conversion therapy, ex-gay ministries, out on the streets, physically abused, mentally abused. And it's one of those old adages of never again, right? I think we can relate to that, but how you go about correcting that is, I think, something that we can, probably come to agreement on. I want to mention also this idea of gender affirmation. So that's a phrase that gets used a lot by a lot of different people, and it doesn't mean the same thing when people are using it. So for example, if I say I'm willing as a licensed clinical social worker to affirm the gender of a client or patient, what I mean is that I'm not going to belittle them in their understanding of their gender. I'm not going to criticize them. I'm not going to question them, but I'm also not going to just endorse it either, right? I'm going to lead them through an exploratory period of time where they can talk about it, like, where do these ideas come from, right? What age were you when you started thinking about this? Because I think oftentimes what people are doing is they're bumping up against, or they're rejecting stereotypes, expectation of gender roles, expectation of gender expression based on their sex. That could come from society, from a family, from religion, from culture. And so I think there's a way to support people who are challenging and pushing against these expectations without endorsing that they need to start taking medicine or have surgeries, right? I was able to just accept that I was not going to be the pretty little girl that some of my family members wanted. And I was totally okay with that. And my dad was okay with it, which was helpful to have at least that one person in my family. And I just ran with it, and it worked for me. So I think trying to be that one person that this young person can attach to, I'm a big supporter of attachment theory. And I think that if you don't have a loving relationship or connection with your parents or some other adult, I think these young people are going to connect to other young people. That's why this contagion thing, I think, is something really interesting to pay attention to. I'll just end by saying that I also don't have the experience of this idea of born in the wrong body. I don't really understand it fully. I know that people tend to ask that question a lot, do you feel like you were born in the wrong body? And I always tell them, no, I'm just happy to have one that works. So I think one of the things that can be helpful is to be able to differentiate between the idea and the reality that trans people are not a monolith. We're very, very different people that have come from different places, from different kinds of families, different cultures, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different education levels. There's a lot of differences about us. And so it's helpful that's why I'm so glad that I'm here, because I think it's helpful to have trans people involved in this discussion, because the non-trans people on the panel will find many, many friends and collaborators in the trans community, as Abigail already found through her book and interviewing trans adults. So we're not the enemy that some people make us out to be out in society. We too want to find a way to help kids come into their own without the indoctrination, as Miriam had mentioned. That should not be part of education.
Awesome. Thank you, Zander. I think it's really enlightening and resonates with a lot of the people because, as you mentioned, nobody's really a perfect stereotype of these masculine and feminine traits. So you highlight that important difference between breaking gender norms as a man or a woman, expanding the range of socially acceptable behaviors for each sex, instead of using those norms to define what a man or woman is. So I think that's something a lot of people resonate with for sure. Thank you. So up next, we have Candice Jackson. Very happy to have you here. She's going to talk about some of the legal side of things. So my question for you is, many people seem to be in agreement that something is wrong about what's being taught, given the moral and medical implications, but people don't seem to know what to do next. Though I think many feel that it will have to involve lawyers to some degree. So as a lawyer yourself, can you talk about what possible legal recourse patients might have and citizens might have for getting gender ideology, or at least its worst manifestations, out of public schools?
Sure, and thanks, Colin, and to FAIR for hosting this event. It's a great discussion. Colin, when I think about the question that way, I think what I would like to take a few minutes to share with parents is some overall suggestions to keep in mind as they consider what their options are, because parents do have options. There are a lot of avenues and ways to push back or object to what parents see being done with regard to gender ideology. So I'll touch on some specific legal rights as well, but in terms of overall strategies, overall things to keep in mind when parents are going to interact with their school, whether it's through a lawyer or hopefully directly to try to have some impact talking with people at the school. Here's some of my suggestions from things that I see. One is be preemptive. Do not assume that what you're worried about with regard to gender ideology isn't going to be an issue for your child until middle school or until high school. This ideology is steeped in queer theory. One of the tenets of that theory is that all boundaries in society are arbitrary and oppressive, and that includes the boundary of age. So it's actually a deliberate attempt to seek to expose your kids to sex and sexuality without regard to any concept of age appropriate. So the gender unicorn and the genderbread person and books like Red, A Crayon Story are used to indoctrinate kindergarteners. People who buy into gender ideology view it as a wonderful thing to indoctrinate your kids to their beliefs as young as possible. So be proactive and preemptive about talking to your school about what's going on. Another tip I have from seeing things fly around the internet is do your homework. Find out specifically what your school policies are and what is in the materials that your school is actually using. Don't rely on, well, I saw on TikTok that schools are doing X, Y, and Z. There are more than 8,000 institutions of higher education in this country. There are over 100,000 public K through 12 schools and at least 30,000 private K through 12 schools. So no matter how uniform federal or state policies or regulations are, I guarantee you there is a lot of variety as to how schools are actually writing up policies, implementing policies, and actually doing and promoting things. So do your own homework and get receipts wherever possible as to what's actually going on in your school compared to the school district next door, much less in the state next door. There's also a lot of variety within each school among the various administrators and teachers, right? So try not to think of approaching the school as a monolith. There may very well be people within the school that do not all see eye to eye on this issue, and you can often find some allies by doing that. I would also say, unfortunately, be suspicious throughout all of this. Unfortunately, the days are gone, I think, when we can send our kids to school and just trust that we're sending them into an environment where Schools are stepping in loco parentis. That's the phrase legally that's used for how and why schools have both a right and a duty to take your kids in and educate and safeguard them. And that's just not necessarily being done anymore when it comes to topics of sex, gender, and sexuality. Don't assume that your school is being upfront or transparent with you about what parents really should be given information on. In fact, unfortunately, a very direct and specific strategy written up by a large law firm for the benefit of gender activists a few years ago, told institutions specifically, hide the ball, avoid public discussion, get gender identity policies written into law and policy by tagging them along things that the public has already come to accept, like equality and equal rights for gays and lesbians. So don't make the mistake of thinking that if you're not aware already of something going on, then maybe gender isn't an issue in your school, or that you don't need to ask some very specific questions and have some very direct conversations with officials and administrators at your school to pin them down on what really is going on. We're seeing teachers coming out of teachers' college and schools of education now steeped in a critical theory of how to educate kids. And, we're now seeing a lot of teachers, almost feel euphoric and almost a hero complex about recruiting your kids into, exploring their sexualities and exploring their gender identities. It used to be, teachers got that warm glow of job satisfaction, after teaching your first grader to read, and now they feel that kind of pride and job satisfaction when their first graders, have memorized all the pronouns of the week. When it comes to specific legal rights that parents do have in this context, it's important to know there are a couple of federal laws and many state laws that do give some opt-in and opt-out rights to parents. So a couple of those federal laws are FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. That gives parents the rights to review and inspect your child's education records and to demand that corrections to those records be made. So you can think of the tie-ins there with regard to, if your child's records have been changed with respect to their names or pronouns or something like that. Problem is, these days schools are doing all they can to avoid the social transition process that they're encouraging with students to become part of the official education records. So FERPA might be a little limited. A lot of state laws allow parents to opt their kids out of sex ed. One of the limiting factors in that route is that these days discussions of sexuality and gender identity are in no way limited to sex ed classes. Instead, they're brought into the school through anti-bullying or LGBTQ inclusion efforts, non-discrimination policies and trainings. So, again, opt out where you can. If you're given the right to exercise the ability to take your kid away from an influence you're not happy with, do it. But you have to realize these days, when it comes to gender ideology, it's just not possible to opt out of everything, because they've intentionally made this ideological approach to sexuality and gender ubiquitous throughout the school curriculum and environment. So, a math word problem now might say, Julie has 10 apples. Then they give 3 apples to their teacher, Mix Smith. How many apples does they have left? Just to make sure that not even math is free from attempts to normalize sex confusion, not to mention grammar confusion. But all the same, use the tools that you have. If nothing else, a lot of schools will respect you sending a strongly worded letter demanding to opt out of everything they allow you to opt out of. And it makes a statement. It lets the school know that you're paying attention and that you are raising concerns. Another piece of advice I'll give is consider your own individual child and your own family circumstances, because there might be some avenues for protesting and getting exemptions from certain policies that may apply to you, but wouldn't necessarily apply to everybody. Two things I'm thinking of along those lines are disability and religion. If your child has a disability and also has an IEP or a 504 plan, then the idea that the school is socially transitioning your child without putting that kind of very significant psychological intervention into the context of your child's special education plan, could raise some very serious legal conflicts for the school along those lines. And then similarly, let's say with pronoun policies or inclusion policies that end up meaning that your child will be exposed to people of the opposite sex in sleeping quarters or showering or what have you. If there's a religious ground that you and your family have for those kinds of policies infringing on your religious beliefs, then that can be another avenue. So I would just say, don't be afraid to ask for specific exemptions that apply just to your child. May not get rid of an entire bad policy at the school, but we protect our kids however we can. The last thing I wanted to mention is just to encourage parents when you're having communications with your school about any of this. There are a lot of tactics out there that are designed to shut you up, to keep you quiet, to make you feel isolated, and to make you feel like even raising a concern along these lines means you're just a right-wing reactionary bigot. Don't buy into those. Don't buy into that pressure. First and specifically, don't buy into the notion that challenging gender ideology is anti-LGBT. Gender ideology and queer theory are harmful and corrosive to gays and lesbians in more ways than we have time to get into right now. Knowing that human sex is binary and immutable isn't anti-anyone. So don't feel insecure or defensive out of fear that raising concerns, that asking logical questions about these policies is in any way prejudiced or bigoted. It's actually the opposite. Figuring out how equal opportunities for everyone can be achieved requires a starting point of acknowledging fact and reality. And then don't feel compelled to use the terminology of this ideology. Use words and language that you believe are clearly communicating what's going on and why you're concerned. Don't feel required to memorize the latest evolving list of neologisms that are thrown out there that change every day of the week and really are designed to be euphemisms to obfuscate what a situation really is and why somebody might be concerned about it. If you are worried about your 14-year-old daughter changing tampons in a bathroom in the presence of boys, say that. Don't feel compelled to say, well, the trans girls are going to be in there because, well, if they're all girls, what's the problem? So you have to, you can be specific and clear about why it's an issue that you're concerned about. That's all from me for now. Thanks.
Awesome. That's so important. I appreciate you equipping all the parents with these useful legal tools. So be bold and do your homework. I hear from people all the time who simply don't believe me when we talk about what's going on in the schools. But if you use the tools you have, FERPA, FOIA requests, you can find these things. You can find the documentation. It's usually right there in plain sight. So thank you so much, Candice, for that. So lastly, we're going to get to Carrie Mendoza. So for you, my question is, many parents are worried that gender ideology is pathologizing adolescence, which is then leading to the medicalization of the school environment. Can you talk about some of the more troubling issues that crop up at this intersection of gender ideology, medicine, and education?
Yeah, thank you, Colin, and everyone for joining the panel. Everyone's, done such a great job. Some of the issues that, I wanted to talk about have already been spoken about. So I'm just going to say a few comments because I see the Q&A just piling up, and I know we want to get to that. So, for me, it's really about activist medicine. And when you are practicing activist medicine, you're really not practicing pro-human medicine because you're really outside the guardrails of what we know is safe, as well as evolving and correcting mistakes medicine has made in the past. So one example that's been touched on is just informed consent. That's a very, very important guardrail in medicine. There's no procedure, there's no medication that doesn't have benefits and risks, and consenting to put something in your body or have a procedure done involves an honest conversation about the benefits and the risks, and acting that like some intervention doesn't have any risks is not practicing honest pro-human medicine. That's activist medicine. I think a second thing that's a red flag is hiding information. That sort of goes along with, not a full informed consent. Hiding information is not what the honest pro-human practice of medicine does. So I've listened to webinars from major medical centers where a gender clinic, for example, was talking about billing labs to check hormone levels under a different code to evade parents from seeing that on their insurance billing. That's illegal, and that's insurance fraud. And so if that's what's going on, then that isn't, something that is honest. And I think a third thing that I've seen that has infiltrated into medicine is really the social contagion element that comes from the internet. One big example we all, I think, know about is just the opioid crisis. Part of it was fueled by, pain scales and reimbursements tied to that, but part of it was fueled by the concept of patient experience, affirming someone's pain in order to get, a good pain score, so the hospital system would get, proper reimbursement or follow regulations. And I see that, Miriam had touched on that, the concept of affirming. And we see that the opioid crisis was a man-made tragedy that still has repercussions that, I deal with in the emergency department every day. And so, when I'm thinking about this issue and my impetus to, do this panel and bring together these amazing people is really to bring into the light the fact that what's going on is activist medicine that is not pro-human and is really avoiding all the guardrails we know that are appropriate to prevent human suffering. And so I'll just leave it at that because there are so many great questions and I know we have limited time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carrie. And I just want to thank all the panelists for going over these questions with us. We're going to move to the Q&A right now. Unless it specifically calls out someone, I'll consider these just sort of open for anyone who wants to address it. So one that I identified here, I think this probably would be more directed at Abigail, but again, anyone feel free if they have a answer they want to chime in with. What are the red flags and yellow flags I should look for when identifying activist teachers?
That's a great question. I would really recommend having a conversation with a teacher. You could even have it explicitly, but I think the best defense is your own kid. You need to be really honest with them about the nonsense of gender ideology. unfortunately. They need to go in armed and recognize this is nonsense, unfortunately. A lot of people are proselytizing it. Nobody's a girl trapped in a boy's body or a boy trapped in a girl's body. There's no evidence for any of that. And if you hear that, let me know. And, just be really open with your kids about what so that they're, because it's going to be all around them. And I would just say, look, we have a big problem. Teachers are mandatory reporters. They are calling child protective services on parents who don't affirm. We're starting to see these cases now. When your kid gets stuck in the system, it's really hard, even for the most loving families, to get your kid back. It's a huge fight. We have a huge problem. And although I think certain of this stuff started out with good intentions, the gender ideology, which came from queer theory, as others pointed out, it's really confusing to kids. It leads to all kinds of problems. I really invite everyone to just watch the Spreckles school board meeting, which just happened, in which a woman shared her own story of how her child was confused, how she was locked out of things and alienated from her own kid. I mean, the heartache of these parents whose kids have been led down this road. Now, just one last thing I'll say. A lot of people are asking me, why? What are they after? Why are they doing this? Activist teachers want control of your kid. They want to be able to supply their values in place of your values, whatever those values are. Okay? It can be about any kind of thing, but that's what they're after, and they're getting it. They're winning this. So, my own view is that there should be no tolerance for gender ideology in the school. Zero. I also think, to a large extent, if they're going to be discussing sexuality or gender with school, they need to inform the parents. We need full transparency, because the schools can't be trusted. They absolutely cannot. They've demonstrated that.
Thanks, Abigail. So this next question is specifically directed to Drs. Grossman and Mendoza. I think this question speaks at kind of the uphill battle a lot of us seem to realize about trying to come across as being legitimate. So the American Psychological Association appears to be in favor of the gender ideology without any sound evidence to base it on. Many clinical psychologists are reluctant to confront the APA out of the fear of being censored and even losing their licenses. What are some maybe specific advices you can give to confront the APA and also the American Psychiatric Association?
Go ahead, Miriam.
Throwing it to her.
Advice on how to confront the big APA and the little APA?
Yeah.
Good luck. They don't want to acknowledge anything that goes against what they've been standing for so long. I mean, I guess people could show up at one of the meetings if there's an actual, in-person annual meeting, and storm the stage and grab the microphones. I mean, I'm joking, I guess, but I don't know what to do. I've written books. I've been out there speaking. They just, they can't. There's cancel culture. They don't want to acknowledge different opinions. So maybe Carrie has another idea.
Well, I would just give the perspective from being hospital-based, working inside a hospital. Again, practicing during the lead up of the opioid crisis, during it, and now the sort of the fallout and ripple effects. Each individual physician has to have moral courage. During the opioid epidemic, I saw, colleagues just sort of look the other way, or, oh, I don't want to, fight the system because of regulations, and I'll, get a bad review online. So we see what happened, people like me who told patients no, or patients threatened me, patients, you know, said I was the worst doctor in the world because I wouldn't write them, you know, strong narcotics for their period cramps. I mean, on and on and on. But, you know, you have to have the moral courage to say no. So I think that's, again, we're in that moment, but the stakes, I can't believe it's even higher that this is going on with kids, that, you know, looking the other way when kids are being castrated or their bodies are being mutilated. So attend the webinars in your institutions, report safety concerns, risk management. I mean, use the levers that we have in the hospital, but I would say, you know, moral courage is needed right now.
Can I just say one thing, Colin? I hope you all know that we're winning. For the first time in a decade, we're winning. Reasonable people are coming together and pushing back and saying, stop indoctrinating my child with nonsense. And I have gay parents reaching out to me, transgender parents reaching out to me, every kind of parents. These are reasonable people who don't want someone they've never met talking to their 7-year-old about their sexuality. So when you push back, I want you to know this is so important. Reasonable Americans are all around you. They want to do what's right for their kids. They just want to see someone else take a stand first. So go ahead and be first.
Yeah, that's super important. I mean, the more people that stand up, you give oxygen to and shade to more people who can feel more comfortable to come up. Just eliminate the spiral of silence, I think, as they call it. So thank you for that. I think this next question goes best to Candice on the legal front. So do parents have the right to claim religious exemptions from any state law that supports educational institutions with calling a teen a preferred name and pronoun? What rights do parents have on this area, if you're aware of them?
As far as I know, there are no established channels for claiming that kind of religious exemption. What there are right now are lawsuits. And so we're gonna have to see how those play out. But the hope would be that application of First Amendment rights against this new manifestation, but it's not necessarily different in principle. It should be something that can be handled. But as far as I know, there aren't any statutory rights or anything that have yet tried to recognize this as a situation that needs some special attention. It's just all within the muddled waters of school wants you to do this. Oh, wait, does that prohibit my speech? Does that compel my speech? Does that compel me to profess a belief that goes contrary to my own religious beliefs? That's what's happening. But it's at this point going to take, I think, some additional litigation to see that point driven home.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this might be good for Zander. Is there a need for the equivalent of a GSA for contemporary free-thinking, gender non-conforming children / families?
So a club within a school setting for people who consider themselves to be gender non-conforming, whatever that means, but are more heterodox in their thinking. Is that the? Yeah,
I think they're saying that it may be getting at the fact that a lot of GSAs have sort of morphed into what we have now. And I think they might be asking about if there's still a use of, the equivalent of what GSAs used to be today.
Well, I had mentioned when I was talking initially about the trans community is not a monolith, and either is the gay community, the lesbian community, or the bisexual community. And I can remember, when I was very young, that, I had lots of different friends that were part of, that they were, I guess, gay identified, lesbian identified, for lack of better terms. And not all of them wanted to be around other kids like them. A lot of them wanted to go off to church after school. They wanted to spend time with their family, or they went off to the Boy Scouts, or, they were like junior police cadets. So it's one of those things, just know that and I think Candice mentioned, or maybe it was Abigail who said, kids don't want to sit around and talk about sex with their teachers, right? But there's the ability to form, there are a lot of organizations out in the communities that have these social avenues for kids. So for example, when I was a teenager, young teenager, we didn't have a lot of the resources that they have now, but I found a pen pal club, and I started writing letters with other young lesbians that were around the country, right? So there are different things that kids want to do. I think that there's a big social risk being a free thinker. And so I think the younger you are, it's a much harder risk to take. I can tell you as a 55-year-old, the risks I've taken they have pretty severe consequences for me socially and professionally in some respects. And so I wouldn't want young people to have to come up against the bullies in our community. There are bullies within the LGBT community. There are bullies within the trans healthcare, professional community. And I know because I've been the target of some of them. So I wouldn't necessarily want to encourage people to be publicly free thinking if they feel like that's a risk that is too big of one for them to take. So, but I haven't heard of anything specifically that would be like a alternative to GSA, other than become a Girl Scout or a Boy Scout or a campfire girl, or something like join some other kind of social club where you're just with other kids doing things. I don't know that we always have to segregate ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. So I think this next question is really good. I'll throw it up to just anyone who wants to answer it. We've talked a lot about the things parents can do, how we can, can we sue schools, all these different avenues to sort of address this issue. But this question, they're asking, what tools can we give our children proactively to prepare them to respond to gender ideology?
Well, I just said before, I mean, one of the biggest tools is just to tell your kids, that this is nonsense. That this is, you might hear this, some people are saying this, but, there's no such thing as a boy trapped in a girl's body or a girl trapped in a boy's body. You're a girl, you're always going to be a girl, and you're a boy, and you're always going to be a boy. There's no harm that comes from telling a kid that they are what they think they are. Of course, I'm not talking about here treatment for gender dysphoria, but I'm talking about proactively. In the absence of any indication of gender dysphoria, there's absolutely no reason to subject your kid to the indoctrination that they might be something else, and now they should start worrying about it, because the pressure will grow on them to start deciding what they are and pick from one of our 82 flags. They will get social recognition in school from that. They will get popularity. The coolest teacher in school will suddenly take a liking to them. So they're up against a lot in these schools. And as I said before, I think parents should show no tolerance for this kind of nonsense in the school. It spreads through a school. It's and by it spreads through the school, I mean the idea that we all have to be some other thing, and we other than our biological sex, and who's going to be more queer today or more whatever the identity happens to be. There's a lot of pressure on these kids to declare one of these identities. So I would just take the pressure off them by having really honest conversations that reflect whatever your values are. And I say that as someone who doesn't want to raise your kids. I don't want to tell you how to raise your kids. You may have, you may feel very differently about, how your kids should be raised in terms of sexuality and gender. And I believe that's your prerogative. Okay. But what I know is it's not the state's prerogative to tell your kid what they should be in terms of sexuality, of gender. That I know. So use your judgment. Your kid, your own values. And I would just say, go with that and don't let anyone get between you and your child.
The only thing I would add to that is the parent of young kids. Yes. And in a specific way, I have tried to go the route of talking to my young kids about this in terms of being very specific about what I know they're going to be hearing and seeing. In fact, it not will be, they do, they see it all around them. And so being descriptive and not using euphemisms and just being very direct with them about saying, you know, that girls are girls and boys are boys, and you're like that from when you were born. There are people, some really nice people out there that think that's not true, think that you can actually just choose whether you want to be a girl or a boy. That's not true. And then there are some people who want to take medicines and have surgeries that make them look more like a girl when they're a boy. But, you know, I try to talk to them very concretely because it's there, it's around them, but hope to give them a framework for this is not something that's up for grabs in terms of, you know, the sky is blue, 2 + 2 is 4, and, you know, sex is what it is. This is a genetic dice roll that you got stuck with, and it is what it is. And it doesn't need to limit you or what you're into or interested in or anything like that. And then I do draw a parallel to religion because for the, you know, in the same way that I want to try to teach my kids how to maintain their own spiritual beliefs and yet interact with other people who have very different or no spiritual beliefs. You know, to some degree, I fit that into that kind of framework as well. In other words, doesn't mean you're not friends with somebody, doesn't mean that you're not respectful to your teacher, it doesn't mean any of that. It just means it's okay to recognize different beliefs, not feel pressured to adopt someone else's belief, and not feel like you have to try to convince everybody you meet about your own belief. So that's the framework I'm trying, and we'll see as childhood progresses whether I have any regrets about it.
I would agree. I think that Candice and Abigail have good suggestions. And I'm just thinking that parents can bring, for example, current events, things into the home, you know, to the dinner table, for example, having a discussion of the transgender swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania and what happened there. Getting into a discussion of biology and what testosterone, you know, a person that goes through normal male puberty is exposed to testosterone and what that does to the strength of his heart and the capacity of his lungs and his, you know, muscle mass, and teach your kids these things, to talk about them at the dining room table and find out what they think. I mean, was that fair? That all those records were broken by somebody was exposed to so much testosterone? You know, yes or no? What do you think? There's lots of opportunities.
Colin, can I just say one last thing? Nothing, I just want to be clear, nothing that I'm saying is necessarily heteronormative. By which I mean, you know, when I was growing up, there was this sense that your teacher, you could be like, you could ask your teacher, do you have a boyfriend? What's going on? And they wouldn't tell you. They wouldn't tell you because they had a sense that their personal relationship was not really appropriate to share with the children, right? They weren't moving in to be your pastor or your guru. They were your teacher. And they kept their private lives to themselves. And I like that line. I think it's healthy, regardless of what their sexuality is. I don't care if their teacher is transgender or not. If they're transgender, then they address them as how the teacher would like to be addressed, Ms. Jones or whatever it is, and you move on. But there's no reason that we have to suddenly throw out everything we know about boundaries between adults and children the moment LGBTQ comes up, okay? We don't have to throw out everything we know to be healthy about boundaries. And yes, you need healthy boundaries between teachers and child. We've always needed them.
So I think this next question speaks to both Candice, Miriam, and Carrie here, possibly. So any legal suggestions for mental health clinicians practicing in Canada, Australia, or other countries with vague anti-conversion therapy legislation that's currently kind of putting clinicians in a bind, because it's the double bind where if you're affirming people, then you could be getting in trouble for, you know, gay conversion therapy, and if you don't, then, you know, this could be trans conversion therapy, or maybe I reversed that. But can you talk about sort of how these conversion therapy laws where they're trying to insert gender identity into these laws might be addressed?
I'd like to hear from Miriam on that one first.
Well, isn't gender identity is already part of the conversion laws? Is there a place where that's not true?
Is that currently the case in the US? I know Canada just passed something.
In 20 states. In 20 states.
20 states,
Not
yeah.
federal yet.
Okay.
I think we're going to need test cases, to be honest with you. I think that the boundary of, I mean, a lot of the state laws at least use phrasing like seeking to change, which is at least different than asking questions, right? But we are getting the sense more and more that the application of these conversion bans does seem to be in a direction of anything short of instant affirmation belief, almost as though affirmation has become confirmation. I'm hearing people say, right? And if there's truth to that, that makes a lot of sense, because there should be a line somewhere between asking questions, or even, I've heard therapists put it this way, joining the patient where they're at, right? But also being able to explore and question. So, I think that at some point we are going to see some test cases where rational, ethical therapists who know that they are doing the best practice in terms of therapy are going to be accused of running afoul of these laws, and we're going to have to hash that out.
Yeah.
So the next question, maybe the last one. I can stick around for a little bit longer, but people in the panel are free to leave because we're up against the final minute now. So this one is from someone we probably recognize. Buck Angel is in the crowd. How is it legal to talk to children about gender identity without their parents' knowledge? Can a parent sue the schools for doing this? And what states is this legal in?
Oh boy, yeah. This trend started a while ago. I mean, specifically for gender identity. Let's say in California, it's only been since a 2016 law that the state officially said, as part of sex ed, you must teach sex ed in an LGBT inclusive way, and you must address sex, gender identity, gender expression. So it's a relatively recent development, but in states like that where it's mandatory to be taught, and the ability of parents to opt out is very, very narrow and limited, the end result is that that's exactly legal, in fact required for schools to do this without giving parents a heads up or even an opt out. The other issue with this is that because a lot of discussion around gender identity and the ideology around gender identity is seeping in from so many different angles, not just sex ed, there's no general requirement other than parental oversight that schools have to disclose every conversation or way that a teacher frames things, or what kind of outside groups is a school bringing in to speak to school assemblies. You may get a heads up, you may not. So it's legal up to the point of being within the narrow confines of an opt-out sex ed program.
Well, but as you mentioned before, even if you opt out from sex ed, it's going to be in social studies and history, and yeah. So gender ideology has been a part of comprehensive sex education at least since the 90s. And if you look at the flagship organizations that create the curricula for students and teachers, such as SECUS and Planned Parenthood and Advocates for Youth, this is, bread and butter stuff. This is all It's not considered fringe, it's bread and butter, basic stuff.
And I would just say, I would point this out in my book, but I think it's worth repeating. And that is, we have this all through California, a very, very liberal state. Okay. What are they creating safe spaces from? What are they really creating safe spaces from in a state where almost everyone votes Democratic and supports same-sex marriage and same-sex equality? It's safety for parents. That's the goal. Keep that in mind. When they have safe zones, very often what the activists are creating is a safe zone from parents, from parent oversight, from parent involvement, and from parent knowledge. This is implicit, it's also explicit.
So this next question, so we're past time, by the way, so if anyone has a hard out, feel free to take off, or I plan on going for another, maybe till 8:45 or so for myself. This next question really kind of addresses what FAIR's goal is and sort of the difficulties with balancing different views here. So the question is, how can we be pro-human to transgender students? By using their new name or pronouns, many teachers are unsure of the best way to show respect to many trans students. I think this goes to show their, if we're being pro-human and using their pronouns, then that conflicts with, if we're basically operating from within their ideology and not pushing back against it. So where's that balance? What do you guys think?
You need parent permission. You're not giving out new names and new identities to children without the parents' permission. This should be absolutely, right now we have a system where letters going home to parents are deceptive. I've had moms call me who were on the PTA, they were in the school every day, and there was a school-wide conspiracy to keep it from the parents that they had renamed the child, okay? They need the parents' permission. If they're gonna start renaming your kid and giving them a new identity, they need to ask mom and dad.
I think that this is where there has to be an analogy somehow to religious belief, because you're going to have some parents who are determined that the school environment must socially affirm their child. And then you're going to have some parents who are determined that that should not happen with regard to their child. Well, it's I think that points to the pluralistic approach is one that we've managed to take with regard to religion, and that is you have to leave it up to the conscience of everyone involved whether or not to openly subscribe, whether sincerely or politely, whether to openly subscribe to a belief that's reflected by asserting that someone's sex has changed, and recognizing that it's just as important for the person who would like to make that request of others to have to understand that that's just not how the world works. We don't and can't actually compel belief and speech that way. So there's going to end up being a pluralistic approach. And on a practical level, I don't know why schools should be so opposed to that, because right now they're the ones setting up a situation where there's a dichotomy in the kid's life, right? That they're called he at school and she at home. So I'm not sure why that's okay, but yet we somehow can't have any plurality within the school environment where some kids out of conscience aren't going to refer to their peer, in an opposite sex way.
And Gavin, or Colin, sorry, I just wanted to add too, that just remember that informed consent, when you're hiding information, you are not at all within the bounds of good medical or psychological practice. And then also, schools aren't a therapy session. You're also involving other kids, and you're asking other kids to call someone something in school, but maybe outside school they're called something else. So you're pulling in other kids into an environment that you don't have a license to practice therapy in your school, nor inflict that upon other children who, have no role in that. So I think people need to remember that as well and bring that up to the school.
The next question we have here is, who do we report teachers, administrators, and Board of Educations to about indoctrination? We have no options in the school district as they're all involved.
That's completely true. And when I wrote the recent piece on this, what was going on, the CTA, the California Teachers Association, what I got was not shock. What I got was an outpouring of parents saying, we've been complaining to the principal for years. We've been telling the superintendent for years. No one's listened. So is this systemic? Yes, it is. It's a systemic problem. So all the parents need to get together. They need to be really open. And as Candice said, look, parents are going to have disagreements. There are going to be parents who are really in favor of this. They're entitled to it. It should be treated as religion, meaning you do what's comfortable for your family. But if you're not comfortable with this, speak up and to make sure every parent knows what's going on. Because honestly, you can trust other parents way more than you can trust, unfortunately, many of these school systems.
So next question is from someone named David. My teen kids are already pretty much on the gender ideology bandwagon, and I'd love to have advice about how to talk to them about these issues without them shutting down the conversation. So we've talked before about sort of inoculating your kids against these things, but what about your kids already been receiving this education? How do you talk to them?
I feel for you. I really do. I fear that, that situation could just be a few years ahead of me. I've learned a lot from listening to therapists like Stella O'Malley and Sasha Ayed talk on their podcast. They have a year's worth of podcast episodes now, and much of it is geared toward communicating to parents about how to navigate these things. And so, takeaways that I've gleaned onto from experts like that have been things like keeping things simple and direct, and yet making sure not to make everything about gender and the differences in perspective, and instead focusing on realizing that sometimes gravitating toward a trans identity or a sexual identity of the moment, can be a teen's way of expressing angst about something else that's going on. And so just being willing to connect with your kid and not make it all about gender. Those are some of the things that I've been listening to from sources like that are trying to help parents understand how to have these kinds of conversations, how to maintain a connection with your child without pretending to believe something you don't believe. Like, I look at my daughter and I gave birth to you. I know you're a girl. I look at my son. Yeah, you're a boy, and that's not going to change. And so, how to maintain a connection while maintaining truth like that is challenging for parents.
Yeah, I would just say one last thing on that is that, don't be afraid to be at the authority with your own kids. Whether they admit it or not, they care a lot what you think. And you mentioned two great experts, on who've given, a lot of great advice on parenting. And I think even Stella O'Malley, because I've interviewed her many times, it would say that parents are suffering a crisis of confidence today, and they feel they need to ask an expert everything. You know what you think, and you know what's true, and you got a whole lot more life experience than they do. Don't be afraid to tell them. And they can get mad at you. Okay, that's not the worst thing in the world, because the influences outside your home are a lot scarier. So I would just say the parents today seem so worried they're going to lose that close relationship with their kids. And I get it. I worry about that too. But be honest, tell your kids what you think. You're the most important authority in their lives, and make sure they know that.
I think also, Colin, is to tag on to what Abigail said is also, don't be scared to say that, you're not going to always feel great. You go through ups and downs and different emotions. I certainly, again, see this in my work in emergency medicine. For 20 years, the amount of, pills that young people are on is just outrageous. I've seen 5-year-olds on psychiatric meds because they're told they're, labeled as bipolar. I mean, we don't know what this does to their brains, but it's this epidemic of, sedating kids. So what, because concerns about how to deal with behavioral problems, or it's a surrogate for other issues. But yeah, don't be scared. I think also to say, especially in adolescence, you're not going to feel great all the time, but it will pass. And you don't, do all these things to Band-Aid over just feeling the feelings and learning how to cope with them. And I know Abigail talked, a lot about that in her book in relation to why this seems to be, a risk factor contagion for, teenage girls. So I think that's important too, to realize.
I'll just add that you want to give your kids a system of beliefs, a belief system. If you don't do that, they're going to go out and find their own thing that they believe in. Teenagers are idealistic. They want to go out there and make the world a better place. And if you don't give them a framework for finding meaning in their lives and positive things, and ways to help other people and causes, they'll find their own. And it might very well be something that you do not believe in.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we're probably at the end here. It's been 15 minutes over. I just want to thank everyone, all the panelists, Carrie, Candice, Miriam, Abigail, Zander. Thank you so much for participating, and thanks everyone in the audience for coming to check out this webinar. We're going to have multiple in the future. This is just one of many, and we'll have probably some debates back and forth with a little more viewpoint diversity moving forward. So definitely stay tuned for more stuff from FAIR in terms of webinars. Thanks, everyone.